So, hi, I'm John Byrne with Poets and Quants. I'm here with three members of the Fortuna team. We have a great 1 hour session for all of you. We are going to explore admissions at three of the best schools in the world to get an MBA from, Kellogg, Booth, and Berkeley. And we have three extraordinary individuals here with us to help navigate your application journey to those three schools. First, a little thing about Fortuna. This firm was founded 6 years ago by former directors of admissions. The differentiation of the firm is clear. What Fortuna tries to do is to bring in former people who had been directly involved in admissions decisions at major schools to help you basically move the odds in your favor at all these very highly selective schools. So these are the same folks who were reviewing applications, interviewing people, recruiting people all over the world, and deciding in an admissions committee whether you would get in or whether you would get out-dinged. Let me introduce them. We have Julie Ferguson, and incidentally, we're calling in from Park City, Utah, where Sharon is. Willie's in Miami, Julie's in San Diego, and I'm just outside San Francisco in San Rafael. Let me introduce Julie Ferguson first. She spent 4 years as Senior Associate Director of Admissions for Chicago's Booth School of Business and has also worked with the Lauder Institute at Wharton. So she has experience at both Booth and Wharton, which often competes these days with each other for applicants, I'll say. With Booth having a lot more scholarship money than Wharton, although Wharton is trying to fix that. We have Sharon Joyce, who has over 25 years, say it ain't so, you don't look that old, 25 years of experience in admissions and student affairs. She left the Bay Area to go to Park City, but at UC Berkeley's Haas School, she served as the Associate Director of Admissions for the full-time MBA program. And before going to Haas, she had been at Carnegie Mellon's Tepper School of Business in Admissions and Career Services, so both the front end and the back end. And we have William Kotas, who better known as Willie, who's been heavily involved with Kellogg since he graduated from the school's full-time MBA program in 1986, 2 years before I did the first MBA ranking that had Kellogg #1 at Business Week. Willie served as director at the school. He was honored as Kellogg's Alumni Volunteer of the Year in 2011 after 2 decades as an admissions interviewer and alumni community leader in Estes, Peru, Brazil, and of course, Florida. Welcome, everybody.
Wow. Thank you.
So let's just quickly take a look at our agenda. And, at the end, we're going to try to leave 15 minutes for your questions. And we'll get to that in a moment. But essentially, we're going to be exploring what are the schools really looking for? How can a candidate stand out in the applicant pool? What are the most common mistakes applicants make in applying to a highly selected business school? What's a good timeline for application planning? And then, as I said before, we'll go to Q&A. We have in the back, behind the curtain, like the Wizard of Oz, someone whose name is Haley Mitchell. And if you have any technical problems at all, you can just go into that little chat box and let her know, and she'll help. She'll also be doing a little curation of the questions at the end. As I said, we'll have 15 minutes at the end. You just type your questions at any time during our discussion in the questions box. And frankly, the earlier you put that in, the more likely we are to get to those questions. And finally, if your boss is peeking over your shoulder and you need to close us down, or you have to sign off early for any reason, we are recording the session, so you'll be able to find the full version at fortunaadmissions.com, the website. All right, so Julie, what exactly is Booth looking for in candidates? And Chicago Booth just released its application deadlines. And surprisingly, unlike any other school, instead of moving their round 1 deadline up, they actually moved it back 6 days, which I know the Boothies are very strategic about this, and I'm sure they think that that's going to give them a little advantage. But what is Booth looking for in a candidate?
So I think that, a lot of the big schools can all sort of speak to the same idea of, looking for a good fit with a candidate. But specifically at Booth, you really have to go into this process knowing your why. Why do you want an MBA? Why do you want to go to Booth? And why is it the perfect program, not only for you, but, why are you perfect for the program, right? Like, what are you going to contribute to the program? So through your application, the idea is that you are going to present yourself as someone who is not only well-versed in who Booth is as an institution, but also as a program, but also who you are as an authentic candidate. So coming from a place of, honesty and deep introspection about, the why, and, translating that into thinking about what Booth is looking for in terms of someone that has, great leadership skills, is very confident, not only knowing what they want to do, but confident in how they're going to get there. As some of you may know, Booth has an extremely flexible curriculum. And so they really expect you to come in, sort of to hit the ground running and know exactly where it is that you want to go with this Booth MBA. So the other thing to think about with Chicago Booth as you prepare your application is that you'll be asked time and time again as a student to put theory to the test, to challenge the status quo. So you have to come in with that mindset of they're not looking for cookie cutter candidates, and they're not looking for someone to just always be a yes person or to always go along with whatever the current trend is or whatever the current thought is, but to really think strategically about a problem and to approach it from different angles and to really bring yourself into the mix. So the idea of fit, and Booth has been all about fit for many, many years now, has many different components. But I would think that, to sort of summarize, the most important component of that is to really know your why and to be authentically yourself in your application.
Right. And everyone knows Chicago Booth has a more flexible curriculum instead of the lockstep core.
Yeah.
It tends to be more quant or data oriented, although I think the school has tried to put on a friendlier face in terms of the quant to attract more women and more non-traditional candidates in the last 10 years. Is it important to know those little details about the program to show that you've done your research in the application?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is important as you pursue the application and as you interact with people from Booth is to show that you've scratched below the surface and scratched way below the surface, right? So to really show them that you understand the culture of the school and therefore you understand how you fit into that culture. So, maybe you don't necessarily need to know the nitty-gritty numbers and details as such, but you do need to understand the history of the school. And I'm sure Willie can probably speak to this with Kellogg too, Booth and Kellogg being in the same city, basically, right? One north, one south. Booth was always the, econ finance school, and Northwestern was always the marketing school. But that's not to say that both of those schools don't have equally strong programs in the opposite direction, right? So Willie can speak to the fact that, Kellogg would have amazing finance, econ professors, quantitative classes, and Booth has a great entrepreneurship program. They have amazing faculty members that study marketing and psychology and so on and so forth. So it's good to know, where the schools have been, where they're coming from, and to kind of understand the psyche of the school, much like, we think about how people put stereotypes on us and assume things based on where we've been or how we look or, whatever it is. You have to think of the school as their own personality, right? An entity.
Right, exactly. So, Sharon, you came from a school that has the smallest entering class of a top 10.
Right.
So it's highly selective. The California location is a magical thing because it is in the most dynamic economy in the world, in the Bay Area. So, Berkeley attracts an unusually high number of applicants for a relatively small class size. How did you weed people out and get to the people that you really wanted?
I would say weed people in. And, and in all honesty,
Let's be positive.
I never wore glasses until I started working for Haas. In my first season, I think I calculated I single-handedly read about 2,500 applications.
Wow.
Well, the point about Haas, though, and I said this once at a recruiting event, and I think that people kind of thought, oh my gosh, and groaned and rolled their eyes, but really we do look like, we look at candidates like snowflakes. No two are exactly alike. And I think that applicants should feel pretty good at, I would say, the most of these programs, most of these top flight MBA programs, that we really do a holistic approach when reviewing your file. And so no one is ever kind of taken directly out of our pool because they don't have a certain GPA or a certain GMAT, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. In terms of how we got through the volume of our applications, we didn't do any triaging based upon industry or job function. That would have been, I think, really challenging for us to do. We would triage by country. And a lot of that is so that some of the folks on our staff could become subject matter experts of a particular country and become more familiar with those academic institutions. And then also so that there was a little bit more of a level playing field when we were reading for those specific countries. Having said, though, that we didn't triage by function or by industry, I can say, though, you know, the more seasoned admissions reviewers start to have familiarity with some of the different organizations and different companies. So, for example, if I was reviewing a file from someone who has a consulting background, I'd be looking for a particular professional trajectory. And if I didn't see that, I'd probably wonder why. And I'd start delving a little bit more into their letters of recommendation to uncover why they weren't on kind of a similar trajectory to other applicants who might be coming from Deloitte or from McKinsey. Does that help answer your question, John?
Yeah, and would you, would there be, you say you divide up the pool by country, do you also divide up the pool by industry? In other words, consultants are looked at in relationship to each other, investment bankers, same thing, engineers.
Like I said, we didn't do it to that level because it would have been really challenging, especially because people jump around. So which silo would you put them in? But I think the more experience that you have, you start looking for things in their work experience, in their resumes, and then also seeing things that should be echoed by their letter writers if they're on a good upward trajectory within that particular industry or within that particular job function.
Right. So Willie, before I mention, 2 years after you graduated, I put together the first Business Week ranking of MBA programs. The world was shocked because Kellogg was _1 back then.
I probably owe you
#1 for really good reasons. I mean, it was one of the few schools that understood the value of teamwork and collaboration. One of the few schools even today that interviews or tries to interview every single applicant. So Kellogg gets to see the interpersonal skills of people up front. And if they're really desired candidates, that interview opportunity becomes a sell opportunity, which back then allowed Kellogg, frankly, to cream off a lot of really terrific applicants in the pool against other schools. How important are rankings?
Okay, I think I should start off by thanking you for all the wonderful rankings you gave to Kellogg. It gave a great boost to my career because I had moved to Europe and Kellogg was very unknown in 1989 or 1988 until the rankings started coming out. And then suddenly I felt like I could walk across the Atlantic without getting my feet wet in the eyes of the recruiters. And so thanks for that, John. I spent 8 years in the employee survey industry, and actually there are lists of companies that are called Great Places to Work that are published every year. And that concept always bothered me because to me, and maybe that's true in a generic sense due to human resources policies, but I think every person, according to the attributes of their personality, what industry, do they want a fast-paced environment and one with a lot of innovation, something very stable, really has their own great places to work. And I think it's the same with each of us should have our own great places to study, which it's hard to replicate in a generic survey that uses a methodology that probably puts more weight on certain criteria than we ourselves would put on.
Right.
So if you look at, Kellogg is published by Poets and Quants, can rank anywhere from number 1 to number 8, according to the survey, Booth from 2 to 6, and a great program like MIT can go from 3rd to 15th. So I think rankings have to be taken very seriously by the administration. Actually, it kind of forces the hand of admissions sometimes to focus more on things like GMAT scores than they'd like to. But I think it's just a general guide. And really what you have to look for is meet as many alums as you can, talk to current students, think through, before applying, you have a lot of time to be really introspective. And what are the things that you value? And what would your personal ranking be according to where you want to go?
Willie, you mentioned GMAT scores, and I can't help but not note that Kellogg's average GMAT score for the last entering class was the second highest in the world, behind only Stanford. Willie, what's up with that?
Yeah, it's funny when you, as alum, considering that you probably wouldn't have a chance of getting in now.
Oh, Willie, they would take you any day. Come on.
Yeah, well, one of the things we do look for are collaborative individuals that are going to get involved after being students at Kellogg. So maybe I would have a shot on just alumni relations aspects. But I think part of that reflects the desire to move up in the rankings. I mean, Kellogg has spent over $300 million on new facilities. We've done a lot of things like revamping the curriculum, and I think we're also attracting a lot of fantastic students now.
Right. Okay, Julie, how can a candidate deepen their school research in order to truly understand the culture of an individual school? I mean, what are the steps that a good candidate should take in helping them decide whether or not they fit with the school culture?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I'd like to just sort of shout out to the people that are participating in this webinar today is that you are in such a great position over the next couple of months leading up to these, September, October deadlines to really take the time to get to know these schools that are on your list, whether it's a short list or a long list. I think one of the most important things that you can do, and I think we probably all agree with this, is to visit campus. I know that sometimes that's not feasible, but if you financially can, and you have the means and the time to go and visit campus, I know specifically at Booth, you have the opportunity when you do a campus visit to sit in on an actual live class. And you can choose the class they have a list of classes that you can choose from to sit in on. And, you have lunch with current students, you really get to meet the admissions people. So going back to the idea of, knowing your why and knowing what your fit is, specifically with Chicago Booth, a campus visit is one of sort of the ultimate things that you can do. Beyond that, if you're not able to get to campus, most of these programs are traveling all over the world, hosting information sessions, alumni chats, that sort of thing, where you can have an opportunity to interact with someone off campus, but still get to know a little bit more about the culture of the school and of the program. So that would be my second sort of piece of advice, is to attend as many admissions events as you can. Being selective of the ones that you go to, like don't just go to a bunch of information sessions that are having the same information is being disseminated, but try to pick and choose the types of events that make sense for you and get a good sort of mix of events in there. I think another thing that people can do is to try to connect, as Willie said, with alumni and current students as much as possible. So think about looking at the different student clubs that a school might offer and connecting with the people that are running those clubs. Shooting them an email, trying to engage with them that way. Alumni, find alumni in your company, find alumni in your city. Alumni are all over the world for any of these schools. Another great way to connect is if you work for one of the bigger companies, chances are you'll have a summer intern from one of the schools that you're interested in. Try to connect with that person and get sort of that firsthand experience, that firsthand knowledge of what it's like to be in the program. And all of these things really help to inform you as you create your application, as you write your essays. And it really comes through in an essay if someone really understands the culture of the school and has really taken the time to get to know the school versus, I looked at your website, I know you're ranked, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to throw a couple of classes in here that I think would be interesting. And there's this one professor that's done some research. Anybody can kind of look that stuff up, but to really engage with the people of the school, whether it's alumni, current students, or the admissions team, will really help give you, I think, that edge in the way that you put together your application. One of the final pieces of advice that I would have is to actually look at the school's employment report. And it's something that I don't think any of my clients at Fortuna have actually come to me having done. And they've actually told me I would never think to do that. And I think that one of the key pieces of importance with that is to understand if your career goals and what you want to do actually fits with what's happening in the program. So looking at the employment report will help give you a good idea of your chances of actually succeeding, not just in the MBA program, but succeeding in what you want to do. And really, anybody in admissions will tell you, one of the things that we look at when we're looking at an application is, not only do you put together a good application, but can we as a program, can we as a school actually help you get to where you want to be? And an employment report's a really great way to gauge that from the research perspective.
All really, really good advice there. I will just say one other thing about it. At Poets and Quants, we run these things called Meet the Class of at each of the major schools. And those pieces are really valuable because, number one, they kind of tell you what the culture is all about, what the latest innovations or changes in the MBA curriculum are, who's in charge and why they're changing what they're changing. But more importantly, they profile 6 to a dozen recent people who've gotten into the school. So you get a real feel for who's the school accepting. And we ask each of them, okay, what's your advice and why did you pick the school? And their answers are very revealing in a way that in one place you can get a heck of a lot of information about the school. And then each of those pieces includes a table that compares the school with its peers across a number of dimensions. And I think that's a really also good starting place because when you do reach out to alumni or current students or you go visit a campus, you do need to have a base knowledge of what the school is about, what the culture is probably like before you can taste, feel, and touch it in an effective way. So I would really recommend these Meet the Class of 2019 in this case, the last series that just appeared on each of these schools. Very, very valuable stuff.
And I would actually, John, just to add on to that as well, one more thing that a candidate can do as they research a school is a lot of the schools have an admissions blog these days.
Yes.
Where the insiders, the admissions team is writing about, what they're looking for, why the essays are the way they are, just sort of that insider information. But also they have, a lot of the schools now are doing the sort of the student diaries. So kind of, like what you guys are doing at Poets and Quants, but from an internal perspective where you can meet current students. So you get to understand sort of what is the mix, right? How are these schools choosing people? Not necessarily you know the formula, but you kind of get an idea for, okay, it's a very diverse group at most of these schools, right? You can't sort of pin your finger on one thing, but you can really start to understand a little bit more through these different resources, what a school might be looking for, what makes someone successful as a candidate there.
Good point.
Yeah, Kellogg has a half-hour webinar that's posted on their site that talks about the 6 things they look for in candidates. And actually, they're going to be updating it next month, taking into account they're adding one more video question and giving a lot of tips. They like to be as transparent as possible so applicants put themselves, their candidacy, with their best foot forward.
Are they adding one video question?
Yeah, no, one more random question.
How do you know that?
He's in the know.
I know a lot of people at Evanston. I have my sources.
That hasn't been released yet, Willie. You're putting a scoop out there.
We heard it here first.
So, Willie, how should candidates interact with MBA alumni from a target school? I mean, what's the approach? I mean, give us a little rehearsal of how you could do that and do it well to get the information that's going to help you as an applicant.
Yeah, I've been really involved. I think I went to Northwestern, or some T-shirts called Nerd Western for the academics, and I ended up really staying in a sense of friendships and involvement due to the people. So I've really been involved the last 20 years in alumni clubs, organizing events and such, and therefore I get contacted by a lot of candidates who are interested in Kellogg, friends of friends that are interested in Kellogg and whatnot. And I think the most successful people, and I think the strategy to take, is to look at it as not a one contact transactional conversation, but a chance to establish a relationship that could potentially last for years. And I've actually, as an alumni, I interviewed several candidates who went to Kellogg who have kept in touch, but some that were actually dinged by Kellogg and went to Ross, Johnson, etc. And they were thankful for the conversations we had, and they've kept in touch, occasionally updating me on their career. So who would I help connect to other alums or other people I know? The person that's kept in contact, that seem really sincere about establishing a friendship, or someone that contacted me once and disappeared. So I think the lesson learned is really, reach out to alums who are in locations or in industries where you're interested in actually establishing yourself, and keeping in contact with them afterwards.
Okay, Willie, let's play pretend. I'm an applicant to Kellogg, and you're an alum. So I'm calling you up and I'm saying, hey, I'm really looking at Kellogg pretty seriously. Here's where I'm coming from. Do you think I'm a good fit with the school? Is that a good opening question?
I don't. Number one, I don't know enough about you, and it doesn't sound like you've done very much research on Kellogg. But I'd say this is a lazy guy in California. I'm not sure if I want to spend time.
Okay, look, I have a 680 GMAT. I graduated from a public university that no one has ever heard of. I'm a solo player. I hate working in teams. Should I apply to Kellogg? No.
Yeah, I'd say
No.
No.
Well, apply you can. I'm sure they'll take the application fee, but they'd prefer you did it because your chances are very, very slim. I think you have to look at alumni club leaders and people that are involved in the boards of clubs is kind of like outliers. It's a fantastic book I'll plug called the 2-Hour Job Search, written by a career coach at Duke's MBA program, that categorizes alumni in 3 buckets, one being boosters, another obligates, and the third curmudgeons. The third group are people that really are never going to get back to you. The middle group, they'll do it, but as an obligation, and they really don't have their heart in helping you. And boosters become really your agents internally in the company they work with or the network they have. And alumni club leaders are boosters in general. So we're great friends for you to have, and we'll put you in contact with as many people. But we do expect you, when we ask you in the future to do a favor for someone else to apply, and that's applying, that you'll come through for us.
Sure. Okay, Sharon. A constant sort of question that many applicants have is, what are the metrics that are most important in an admissions decision? And we know there's a great variety of them, and obviously the most glaring ones are your basic raw stats, your GMAT or GRE score, your GPA. But then it's also, how selective was your undergraduate school? How selective was the job that you have? And then what company are you working for? And what progress have you shown? And what are your recommenders saying about you? And, how well put together are your essays? And what do they reveal about what you know about the school? And on and on and on. How important is a GMAT?
I think you've already handed me a loaded gun. I mean, we're talking a little bit about the analogy I made that, again, every applicant it's like putting a puzzle together to see how all those pieces fit. You know, in my mind and in my experience, when we look at the quantitative pieces that go into review, so looking specifically, I don't think I can talk about GMAT without also addressing GPA, because we look at them somewhat in tandem. You know, if you have a lower GPA, a higher GMAT might help offset some of that. When we look at your transcript and look at your GPA, we're thinking of that in how did you persist over time in an academic setting, and what is sort of your landscape that led up to the grades that you earned. Because again, looking at a transcript and looking at your GPAs, we're also wondering what were you doing at that time though too? Were you involved in extracurricular activities? Were you holding down a job? Were you a first generation college student? Those types of things when we're reviewing your GPA and thinking about your academic persistence in your undergraduate institution. And as you've already mentioned though too, the institution that you attended, the rigors of the major that you chose, if you chose a minor. So all of that goes into the review of your GPA. The GMAT, the GRE, you know, in my mind, it's more of a present day check on how you might fare academically. And there is some predictive validity, which is why we look at GPAs and GMATs and GREs in part of the admissions decision process. You know, on the other side though too, we have all of the qualitative factors that you've mentioned, looking at your work experience, looking at the content of your essays, what your letter writers have to say about you. Should you be invited to interview? How does that go? But getting back just to kind of one piece, so I think that sometimes applicants get really kind of hooked on looking at an average. So they'll look at the school's profiles and they'll see the average GPA and they'll see the average GMAT. I highly, highly, highly encourage everyone to look at the range that schools accept, because I think that that's more telling about the program. And I think sometimes it can be a lot more encouraging. Just a brief story, we had an applicant at Haas who on paper was, you know, akin to a god, almost a perfect GMAT score, a 4.0 from a really tough undergraduate program, and just thought, gosh, you know, can't wait to meet this person on interview day. Within that same round, we had an applicant who had a 2.6 GPA, pretty okay GMAT, I think about a 660 or a 670. And then after we deliberated post-interview day, the first person that we removed from our pool was that kind of stellar applicant on paper, you know, and one of the third person we admitted into the class was the person with the 2.6 and the lower, you know, the pretty okay GMAT score, but certainly not a 780 candidate. So it's not just about the numbers. I mean, obviously you should pay attention to those quantitative pieces, but the qualitative factors are just as important.
So, you know, before we went live, Sharon made the point, which made me laugh out loud, that being a dog owner is not an extracurricular that will help you on your application. Really, what kind of extras will in fact help an applicant make his or her case?
Well, I can tell you from my personal experience, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Ecuador when I applied to Kellogg. And I took care of over 200 rabbits and guinea pigs. And I think that extracurricular actually did help me.
Peace Corps being the main thing.
Willie, only at Kellogg. Booth, Wharton, and Columbia would have rejected you outright.
Yeah, I don't want to go into the history of my applications from the 80s right now, but actually I was accepted by Kellogg twice. This was pre-internet, and by the time the acceptance letter reached me in Ecuador, I was too late to apply for financial aid, so I had to apply the next year. So I feel kind of fond to them in that sense. The question was, what about the different extracurriculars?
Yeah, what extras can really help you as opposed to just being neutral or maybe even negative?
Well, I think anything, Kellogg really is placing more and more weight on social impact. So they're looking for people that really are moving the needle on different causes that really improve society, improve the countries that they live in, democratize education for the people in the lower end of the economic strata. And so Kellogg is looking for things that you're really passionate about, what hobbies you have and interests you have, really looking to put together classes where you can, what you're interested in will bring something unique to the student body. I mean, Kellogg, I think, always looks for well-rounded candidates. We've also, we have a student talent show called Special K Review. So probably if you play the trumpet or clarinet, that'll bump you up more than for other schools. So it is one of the 6 variables that really go into the Kellogg's formula for judging candidates.
But extras are also a place to show leadership ability and impact. So like being a member of a community organization is not as impactful as being the leader of one, who actually accomplish some substantial goal. And then you're really moving your extras forward on your behalf, right?
Right. And if you've been involved in organizations, this is really a good time in a few months, try to take on more responsibilities at those extracurricular activities. That was a good point, John.
Yeah. Julie, how can a candidate address a weakness in their application? Now, despite the fact that Sharon talked about the godlike candidate who ultimately rejected,
right, there
are very few godlike candidates, very few people who walk on water, very few people who have the perfect application.
Right.
And the truth is, admissions people know that. But at the same time, if you have a low quant score on the GMAT or the GRE, or if you have a subpar GPA, what are the kinds of things that you need to do to offset those weaknesses? Yeah.
And I think that's such a great point that you just made, John, just going into this knowing that there really are very few, and dare I say, no perfect applications, right? There's always going to be something that as a candidate you feel like you could be better at, or you could have done something differently in the application. But if we specifically look at an area of weakness, such as a lower GPA from maybe, a smaller school, or a subpar GMAT. I mean, Booth's average is 730, but as Sharon spoke to, it is really important to look at what the range is, because a lot of these schools, if you look at the range, they're admitting people with, a GMAT in, the 610 to 620 range, all the way up into, the high 700. So it is important to take a step back for yourself, and I think for your self-esteem, and say, okay, I don't need to have a 750, but say you have a 670 and you are applying to a Booth where the average is a 730, and, maybe the quant part of your GMAT was particularly, that's kind of what brought your overall score down. One of the things that we've advised our clients to do is to take a quantitative course, whether it's online or maybe locally, if you're in an area that has, a decent opportunity where you could take a class to show that you can manage the workload. So, the GMAT and especially a GPA, being an undergrad GPA, sometimes there's a reason or an explanation that you can give to an admissions committee about, why did I not do as well in my undergrad? The GMAT's a little trickier because, some people are good test takers, other people are not great test takers. So as much as you can mitigate that with some sort of factual thing that you can present the admissions committee to say, I can handle the work. Because that's really what it comes down to is, in my mind, as I'm reading the application, I'm thinking, is this person going to be able to handle the rigor of a Chicago Booth, where there are a lot of quantitatively focused courses, and you have to be able to sort of, stay with the pack and run with the pack. One of the other things that I would say is to use the optional essay. And a lot of our clients will come to us and they want to use the optional essay to basically write a longer required essay, right? But the optional essay truly is there as an opportunity to explain something about your candidacy that you don't have an opportunity to do so in another part of the application, right? So if it is a lower GPA, if it is a lower GMAT, if it is a lack of extracurriculars, to Willie's point, the optional essay is just a great opportunity to write the admissions committee a note saying, I just want to explain myself. I want to kind of give you some insight as to why, without giving excuses per se, but just to explain the situation and give them a better idea of where you're coming from. So I would say those two things. If it's a quantitative issue, try to take a course. And hopefully you do well in the course and you can, present that as fact of I can do well in the program. And two is to use the optional essay to, really give the admissions committee insight as to what's going on behind the scenes.
Right. Good. Sharon, a lot of issues result from the whole recommendation process. There are candidates who are in a position where they're almost afraid to ask their supervisor for a recommendation because the supervisor may not look that well on them because, hey, they're going to run off. They're going to leave me. Maybe I'm not going to think about giving a raise, a bonus, a promotion to this person. How do you handle that?
I had a Fortuna client who was going through that same issue last year, and it was challenging because they would sometimes have to sneak out to their car so we could have covert phone conversations of admissions. Admissions committee members, we are very compassionate people. I've noted that most of the applications where you do need to provide information about who are going to be supplying letters of recommendation on your behalf, there is a section sometimes that will prompt you to address whether or not you're using a current supervisor. And I do recommend that, you do have to sometimes proceed with caution. You're not guaranteed to get in. So if you out yourself and then you end up not getting in, sometimes there is the concern about maybe being passed over for a really neat project or a title change or promotion. With this candidate, what we ended up doing is he used someone who had left their firm, but who had supervised him. And so they were able to provide appropriate commentary on his readiness for business school. And he had someone who was at a managerial role in another department who had also worked on projects with this candidate, who was also able to supply a letter of recommendation so that the candidate didn't have to worry about jeopardizing his standing with that organization. At the end of the day, and Julie just alluded to it a moment ago, again, if there's anything that would come off as kind of weird or unconventional, find a way to explain it to the admissions committee. So again, in this case, use that section if it asks why you're not using your current direct supervisor and let us know. And also, one thing I do want to mention, we were able and we were thankful that he did have other people that he could call upon to provide letters of recommendation on his behalf. You need to make sure, though, that you are choosing someone who has supervised you in some capacity. Just because you can't use a current supervisor, please don't default to thinking that it's appropriate to submit a letter from a colleague or someone who's one of your subordinates. Obviously, that's a huge conflict of interest. But just know that admissions committees, we are sympathetic to that.
So, Willie, what are the most common mistakes that candidates make in applying to a highly selective business school?
I think one of them you actually covered on Poets and Quants, which is not answering the question. I don't know how many times I've read essays that sound like they've been slapped together by taking part of their Booth application, part of their Haas application, and trying to format it into a Kellogg answer. And the other, and I've heard this from several people in admissions at Kellogg, is not being true to yourself and answering the way that you think Kellogg wants you to answer. I remember when I was applying to Wharton 30 years ago, they had a really great essay question. If you were being sent to the moon for 1 year, what 3 personal possessions, 3 books, and 3 records would you take with you? And I think it was the hardest thing for me to answer because I got into that gap, just like I'm talking about. Do I want to say it would be embarrassing probably to tell you what 3 records and books I would have taken? Or did I want to say something the University of Pennsylvania's librarian would recommend? And that's hard sometimes for applicants to do, to be true to themselves. And that's, I think, what people in admissions really stands out to them, when people aren't answering authentically.
Julie, common mistakes that you've seen?
I would definitely piggyback off of what Willie was saying, and it really just harkens back to what I was saying about Booth. It just knowing your why and being authentic and not just going along with what you think the admissions committee wants to hear. But in addition to that, I would say thinking that, well, why wouldn't they want me? There's confidence and then there's arrogance. And those are 2 very different things. So confidence in how you approach the process and how you interact with people is great. Arrogance is not. So I've actually, in my time at Booth, I remember someone came in for an interview and sat down across from me and literally said, "Are you qualified to interview me?" And I was like, well, interview over, I guess. So, to be confident as you step into that realm and into that space and in your interactions, but remember that, that you bring something to the table that is just as important as what someone else might bring to the table. And it's not more important, it's equally as important.
So Julie, was it a guy who asked you that question?
Yes.
I figured. Unbelievable. I hope he got rejected.
He didn't get in.
Thank God. Sharon, anything to add?
I mean, I can only, again, say the authentic piece. I think just to frame this for the folks who are on the chat today, when we're in the thick of an admission cycle, I know my reading was 30 files a day, at least 3 days a week from about October till the end of April, beginning of May. And so when we're reading, we really want to get to know you as a person. Similar to Willie's anecdote, 10 years ago, almost a decade ago, Haas had a question: if you could have dinner with anyone, who would it be and why? And what would be on the menu? And I honestly, if I had $1 for every time someone wrote Steve Jobs, I would be a very wealthy woman, or at least I'd have a nice vacation. And so, I think that it's important to just really think about putting yourself out there and maybe even taking a risk. So the best response to that essay, and I remember it so vividly, is we had an applicant write about Dolly Parton, the country western singer, was the person he would like to have to go out to dinner with, a Southern recipe, a Southern, full Southern dinner. But, his essay was fun, but it also had some points that were really heartfelt, and the reason he was choosing that person was that she had a hard Scrabble life. He had overcome challenges as well. And so there was a connection, though, too, in terms of making it relevant to his pursuit of attending Haas. So again, I think just being genuine. And I have one other point, though, too, John, in terms of just things that candidates should think about is, I think for all of us too, sometimes when we're reading applications and we get super excited about an applicant and then we shift and start reading their letters of recommendation and they fall flat, it's really a bummer because we started to warm up to you on paper and then here's these letters of recommendation that don't really resonate, that don't help clarify what you've done, they don't bolster what you've done, or they suffer from what I call the flowery adjective syndrome. They say a lot of nice things, but there's no concrete examples, there's no evidence. And so I think that all applicants really need to think about managing your letter writers. Make sure that you don't just say, hey, here's a link, please fill this out for me, but really go into it like a business meeting, bring along some materials that they can refer back to when they start to draft a letter on your behalf. Little tips, little reminders of the things that you accomplished while you were being supervised or on a project with them, a copy of your resume. And I think it's useful to also give them, even if it's just in draft form, some of your essays that really get at the heart of why you're pursuing your MBA, your short-term plans and your long-term plans. Because after you leave that meeting with them, when you've given them all of these materials to write a strong and compelling letter on your behalf, it's not like they quickly whisk to their desktop and start writing on your behalf. They're going to throw all your stuff into a bin and look at it a few weeks later after you ping them to do so. And so I think it's important to give them materials they can work from. One thing I would say, and I hate to say this, I would also lie to my letter writers and tell them that the letters of recommendation are due at least 2 weeks before the deadline. Yes. Many times we will come in the day after a deadline and we have a couple voicemails of like, oh my gosh, my letter writer was in China and their internet was blocked, so they couldn't submit the letter. Or, oh my gosh, my letter writer went into labor and they're having a baby right now. That's a joyful thing, but that's not our problem. You needed to have submitted your letters on time, and that person, those people will subsequently be moved into another round. So I think it's, as much as you can manage everything in your application, it's also important to think about managing your letter writers.
Right. So I love that question that no longer appears on any application, who would you have dinner with and why, or what would be on the menu? I guess if it were out there today, you wouldn't want to say Elon Musk or Sheryl Sandberg. Maybe you'd want to say Robert Mueller or Paul Manafort. Anyway, we got a lot of really good questions. I want to take one from Derek right away. And this is a common one as well. GRE versus GMAT. How should candidates select which exam to take? Why don't we go to Julie on that one? Because Chicago Booth was a laggard in deciding to accept the GRE. And I think even today has a preference for the GMAT and is one of the few schools to do so. What's your sense of that?
Well, I think that most of the schools still fall back on the GMAT because historically that has been what they look for as an indicator for success. But
even though they claim no preference?
They claim no preference, and I think that the needle is moving a little bit, and they're starting to think a little bit more broadly about how historically only wanting the GMAT and pushing for the GMAT has now pushed the needle in the GMAT so high. And as Willie said, it becomes like a ranking thing too, right? Like what's your average GMAT? And it becomes a number that a lot of actually admissions people don't necessarily love because it kind of pigeonholes you a little bit, I think, right? So you get to this point where candidates think like, well, my GMAT has to be this in order to, in order for me to even apply or for me to even be considered, when that's not really true. And also the influx, I think, of over the last 10 years, or really more than that, of engineers, people with an engineering background who just score off the charts on the GMAT is pushing that needle a little bit higher as those people start to consider business school a little bit more than maybe they did historically in the past. So I had a client in the last round that took the GMAT many, many times and just couldn't move the needle on that. And he was getting really frustrated, and he was working with a tutor, and the GMAT just wasn't his test. And so, together we worked to conclude that the GRE might be a better option, and to better highlight how he might do in the program, but then just bolster that with other pieces of the application, right? To make sure that the committee understands that you didn't just take the GRE because it was an easier test, but that you have all these other qualities, not just an ability to take a test well, but you have leadership abilities, and you have the confidence, and you have the skills that you're going to bring to the table. So it really is just one piece of the puzzle. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to choose the test that you feel you can shine the brightest in, right? The one that you are going to do the best in, knowing that most of the schools out there now are really much more accepting of the GRE, and they have their sort of internal formula for figuring out if you scored this on the GRE, this is what it would have translated to roughly on the GMAT, even though they are two completely different tests.
Yeah. And the GRE has gained significant market share against the GMAT. And in part, that's reflective of more female applicants who are more likely to take the GRE than the GMAT, and more non-traditional candidates getting into business school.
Right.
So, at a school like Yale SOM, more than 1 in 5 of the enrolled students got in with a GRE today. And if you look over time at almost every elite school, a higher percentage of people are getting the GRE, but you're right, the GMAT is still the predominant test. And I think there are a few schools that have a fairly open preference for it. NCOD is one where basically if you do not submit a GMAT, and yet the GMAT test was available to you, you will be rejected. And like I said, Chicago Booth, because of its quant-related curriculum, has long preferred the GMAT. I still think they do, even though they now accept the GRE, because they were one of the very last schools to accept the GRE. Derek also has another really good question. He says, I understand that experience is a critical part of our applications, but there is a point where a candidate may be considered too experienced to join the non-executive MBA program, either due to age or work position. What is that point? Willie?
I can't answer for all schools, but my feeling is that once you pass, unless you're from a country that has obligatory military service and maybe you started your career a couple of years late, it would roughly be around 32, 33, where you might actually fit a lot better in an executive MBA than the full-time program. There are outliers. There are people that actually, apply to full-time programs that are accepted in their late 30s. There are also stellar candidates that don't want to leave their job that apply to an executive MBA without 8 or 10 years of work experience and become the youngest person in their cohort. But I would say it's generally about that age.
Right. And, it varies from school to school. European schools tend to take slightly older candidates. Other schools outside of Harvard, Stanford, which tend to like younger people because they feel they're more able to mold them, are often more accepting of slightly older people as well. Here's another question. I think we briefly discussed this, but I think it's important for a lot of people. And it's, again, it's about the GMAT. It's a candidate who's asking, how important is it to have a GMAT score above the median for your target dream school? Sharon, you want to take that?
Well, again, it's just another piece. And I think we keep emphasizing this. And I think it's important to look at the range. I think that if you're test taking and you're someone who's an achiever and you want to have a goal to strive for, then, certainly make that your goal. But to that end, the GMAT is not going to be the end all be all. As I already mentioned, anecdotally, we had someone who had almost a perfect GMAT score. And at the end of the day, it didn't make a difference in terms of how they were received at Haas, because they had other attributes that were just really counter to the Haas principles in terms of, confidence without attitude and things like that. So, study as much as you can, obviously, do your best work, put your best effort forward, but you just can't be fixated on one piece of your application. I sometimes worry if students get too fixated on a score or on a GPA, the things that they have more control over, the qualitative pieces, sometimes fall to the wayside. And that's too bad, because that's also just a missed opportunity to shine in other areas in terms of making sure that your essays portray a really strong voice that will appeal to schools, making sure that spent time coaching your letter writers on what to do to make sure that you're putting out their compelling letters of application. So again, just keep in mind that GMAT is just one factor in the review process.
One point that was made in an earlier Fortuna webinar that I moderated, which I think is a really interesting point, which is this. If you are from a mainstream feeder industry into an MBA program, you are in a highly competitive cohort, and you're expected to have a GMAT score probably near the average or slightly above it. If you're a non-traditional student or someone from a place that is underrepresented in the applicant pool, you probably can get along without having a danger sign pop up with a below average GMAT. You accept that?
Who wants to go first?
I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that statement. I just view it a little bit differently in the sense that, say you're coming from a consulting background or, a finance background, there's just a lot of those people. And there has to be a way to start to weed them in or weed them out, as Sharon said earlier, right? Versus someone coming from more of a, the social impact space, that there's not as many people applying with that background. And it's getting, it's growing. I think with business school, people coming from entrepreneurship backgrounds and social impact backgrounds, nonprofit backgrounds, but that pool is a little bit smaller. And therefore, it's not, I don't want to say that it's not as competitive as the bigger pool, but when I'm looking at a pool of consultants, there has to be a baseline. And one of those baselines is going to be the GMAT, as sort of like, okay, everybody's on equal footing here. And then we start, dialing down from there versus, comparing candidates from a different pool, say, the social impact pool. That's just going to be you're going to look at it from a different perspective. So I wouldn't say that because you're coming from one of those pools that's smaller, that you can get away with having a GMAT that's lower than someone coming from consulting. It's just you're competing against a different set of people within your own pool, but you are still competing with the overall pool of people.
Okay.
But also, and to Julie's point, just quickly, I mean, there's just a matter of the familiarity that we have with, specific areas, but also some of the bigger firms like McKinsey and Deloitte, they are doing things to support their analysts who are going to be going toward MBA programs. And so they also have a little bit more of a leg up sometimes in the process as well, because they're being supported toward that goal. Whereas people who are coming from more, non-traditional backgrounds sometimes don't have that same advantage as well. And so we're cognizant of that when we're reading through files as well.
Like the Peace Corps, right, Willie?
Exactly.
I don't imagine there were many MBAs on your Peace Corps tour with you who you could consult with and gain advice from.
Actually, I can tell you that I really felt the fact that I had no one to talk to when I was applying to Kellogg, and I'm convinced two things influenced me. One is all my life I've been fanatical about the color purple, and I saw the Northwestern catalog, and that closed the deal. And the other is I went to study marketing, and Kellogg even back then was famous in marketing. But I didn't do any of the FIT exercise all of us have been talking about. I couldn't do through lack of resources in rural Ecuador.
Right.
Right.
Okay, for Booth, Kellogg, and Haas, how important is it to apply early? And would you recommend round one or round two? That's a question. Sharon, you want to start?
Again, it's when are you really ready? I think that there's nothing worse though in round one when we're being slammed with a bunch of applications and there's a certain percentage that it's a rush job because they felt pressure to get in by round one. Certainly you're at a competitive advantage getting in for round one. But at the same time, my word of caution would be, though, if you're not ready to submit in round one, don't, because we will read into that pretty easily. Those tend to be the applications that have some errors within them. You can tell that there was a rush job with letter writing. Your application should be near perfection by the time you hit that submit button, and it should be work that you're proud of. And so I wouldn't sacrifice being really proud of my finished piece versus trying to get it in by round one.
So you agree that you apply when you can put forth the best application, but should you wait for round three?
That's a little bit harder because there are less seats available. So unless you're really, one of the a really pretty shiny candidate, round three is going to be tough.
And if you're an international candidate, it's not the round for you due to we can get into visa issues, but
right. And typically, round three is left to help craft a diverse class. So it's to fill in little gaps that a school might have. You might have too few Peace Corps people, or too few Teach for America people, or too few people from Peru, and then you're just slotting them in. Is that correct?
Well, and also to echo a little bit though too, we're also going to roll over people and look at them again who were on the way, I know holding pattern from round one and round two. So you're not just competing within round three. You also have some people who are pretty darn near. We just wanted to see some more candidates. And so round three is a tough nut.
Now, one person is asking this question. On their website, Haas discourages applicants with a 3-year undergraduate degree. That's something I didn't even know. Should I be worried since I have a 3-year undergraduate degree from India? And if so, how can I mitigate it in my application?
So one thing to remember about Berkeley is that we are part of the UC system, the University of California system, and we are governed by some rules that are dictated to us by our graduate division. I am guessing that is something that is from the graduate division from the UC system. What they should do is they could contact Haas directly, but I'm guessing that it's probably a degree that's not recognized by the graduate division. So it's not something necessarily dictated by Haas per se, if that makes sense.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's what I assumed as well. If you went to a top college in your country, but it's not well known globally, how best to communicate that? Julie?
I mean, yeah, I think, especially having worked at the Lauder Institute, which is the combined MA MBA program at Wharton, right? So it's an international studies program. So a lot of international sort of, people coming in, but even working at Booth, a lot of people coming from Asia, India. And I think that from an admission standpoint, admissions teams are becoming more familiar and more well-versed with sort of, what other schools are out there. Obviously, I think most of us know what the top undergraduate programs are in the United States, but we might not necessarily be familiar with, other universities in other parts of the world. But first and foremost, make sure that you can get a transcript, an official transcript. Like some schools will actually verify that the school exists, that program, that the transcript is real, that it is official. But I just don't think that it should be as much of a concern nowadays as it might have been, maybe 20 years ago. I mean, a quick Google search will tell an admissions person, if that school exists, and what it's all about. So, but especially for, I think, some of the foreign schools, the translation of grades can be really, can be a little bit iffy. And a lot of the schools have addressed that specifically in their FAQs. How do we, how am I supposed to submit a foreign transcript, or how do I translate, my grades from this school into like the US system? So I would definitely check the FAQ section of, any of the schools that you're applying to. And if all else fails, just like anything else, Sharon just mentioned this in what she was previously talking about, is just reach out to the admissions team, make a phone call, send an email, and ask them, sort of what is the best way to navigate that, and how do they recommend students move forward with their application having come from, maybe I'm putting unknown in quotes because there's how many hundreds of thousands of institutions out there that you can get a degree from. So.
Indeed. Okay. One last question. If you apply to a program and you already have a graduate degree, does that help you or hurt you?
I think I would be interested in the story of why did you go toward a master's in something else, or even a PhD, and what is bringing you back to wanting to get your MBA at this time? I know that for us at Haas, we would still default to looking to your undergraduate GPA though, because that's the level playing field. That's a requirement everyone has. So we wouldn't necessarily look at your master's level grades in lieu of your undergraduate grades. But I think if there's a good story to tell and it's interesting and it makes sense, it's something that could certainly diversify you in a pool in terms of other things that you could bring into a classroom discussion based upon your other graduate level experience. But there needs to be some logic to it, and it needs to make sense. It can't look like you're a professional degree collector, that you don't really want to go out and work, and you're just moving from academic program to academic program.
All right. Well, boy, that went by fast. I want to thank Sharon in Park City, Utah, Willie in Miami, Florida, and Sharon in San Diego, California for a great session. If, in fact, any of you missed part of this, you can come back to fortunaadmissions.com and find the full recording in the archives, so you can look at it again. If you have any lingering questions, our three panelists are happy to answer them. Just email them in and Fortuna will get back to you. Meantime, this is John Byrne with Poets and Quants. Good luck to you on your MBA journey. Start early. Create the timeline right now for all the different deadlines that you have to meet. Get rid of the GMAT or the GRE as soon as you can to give yourself a chance to retake it if you need to. And otherwise, I hope you get into your dream school. Thanks for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.